Hello and welcome to the second episode of the York Experimental Archaeology Research podcast. My name is Andy Langley and I'm a PhD research student in the Archaeology Department at the University of York. In this podcast, we aim to bring you interviews and discussions with leading experts in the fields of experimental archaeology, material culture, and craft working. Today I'm talking with Jess Bates. She's also a PhD researcher in the York Archaeology Department, and we discuss her work on the Flint artefacts discovered at the Mesolithic site of Star Carr and the relationship between microwear analysis and experimental archaeology. There will be links in the episode description to further details about techniques, the Star Carr site, and other interesting things that we mention. We hope you enjoy the show. Afternoon, everyone. So we are here on probably the hottest day of the year so far, and I'm here with Jess Bates. Jess, how are we doing?
Good, thank you. Yeah, a bit warm, but we're good.
Yeah, surviving the heat. So just give us a bit of a background into your sort of academic route and the progression to where you are today.
So I got into archaeology in a bit of an unorthodox way because I actually started looking at a BA history for an undergrad degree, and I was really interested in stately homes. I did a bit of a food project when I was at GCSE, really interested in the history of food. So I always thought that history was the way to go and loved the Tudors, although it's really cliche, loved the Tudors. And then on results day for my A-levels, I didn't get my grades and was really, really gutted. And rather than getting a rejection from York, I actually got an alternative offer for historical archaeology. And yeah, I never really thought about archaeology before. To be honest, I didn't actually realise you could study it as a degree. And thought that I loved York so much that why not, we'll see how it goes, and it sounds really interesting and sort of does align with my interests in a way. So I started in September, and by the November I was just absolutely in love with it. I adored all parts of it really, but mainly prehistory, which was something I'd never ever learnt about before starting my BA. And my eyes were just opened to this whole new world of sort of uncertainty, but intrigue, and just all these new species and new sites that were so deep underground. It just absolutely fascinated me. So that's when I switched to straight BA archaeology. So I could do prehistory, and yeah, that's kind of that for me. That was when it all started.
So that was in your first year, was it?
Yes, yeah, that was in the first term of my first year. So it captured me early on. And then, yeah, so through my second and third year, I began to specialise into the Mesolithic specifically. And I was really lucky. I got to work at Star Carr in my first year as well. So that was an amazing experience, which I think really influenced my path, looking retrospectively. And then decided to do a master's, and went away from York just to try something different and to make sure that my love affair with York was not just because it was York, but because it was genuinely, really, really good. So I went away to a different university, did a slightly different topic for my master's, and then came back to York to do a PhD, which was just the best thing ever. And going away definitely made me realise how much I loved it. And yeah, it's great to be back.
It's interesting, isn't it, how often people come at archaeology from totally different angles and not directly into archaeology from A level.
Yeah.
And then Star Carr obviously sounds like it was a big formative part in your undergraduate, and now you're working on Star Carr material as part of your PhD.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, if someone had said to me in first year when I was sort of digging away, probably not enjoying it as much as I should have, considering it's such an amazing site. I think the rain certainly got to me, as it does, I think, with most people that excavate in the UK. But yeah, it was an amazing experience that definitely shaped my fascination with the Mesolithic, and learning about, for me, it was the interpretive potential of the site, really, that there was so much that we didn't know. There were so many things that were so up in the air about the people that lived there and who they were, and how they lived their lives, essentially. And for me, that was something that just was so interesting, because there were so many possibilities of what it could what the site could be and what it could represent in their life, but also I think, yeah, being able to explore the range of data as well, you know, from faunal remains to the lithics. And yeah, like you say, now looking at the lithics from Star Carr, it really, yeah, some days I pinch myself thinking, I can't believe I'm actually looking at this amazing stuff again, because it's such a 1 in a million site. I think that most people that study archaeology at some point have heard about it, which is, yeah, makes me feel very lucky indeed.
Well, for those who haven't heard of it, maybe as an introduction to your PhD in more detail, why don't you give us a bit of background on Star Carr and
Yeah,
where it is
sure.
and time period and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a site in North Yorkshire, so located in the Vale of Pickering. So it's just north of York, in between York and the coast, sort of near to Scarborough. And during the Mesolithic, it would have been sort of quite away from the coast, as the coast was obviously a bit further out into the sea, with the UK still connected to Europe at this time through the Doggerland. So it's about 11,000 years ago, roughly 9,000 BC. And the site is just, yeah, incredibly unique. It has at least three post-built structures that were found there, which is incredibly rare for the Mesolithic and the early Mesolithic in Britain. These were made of wood, so usually they're very ephemeral in the archaeological record, and people can quite easily just sort of dig through them, thinking that they're just sort of slightly darker patches in the soil. And there were amazing artifacts found there, incredibly rare. So you have the antler frontlets, which are deer cranium, essentially, that have been modified significantly. So they almost look like, they're called headdresses sometimes. And again, they're one of the things actually I wrote about in a first year essay, that how do we interpret these, and how do we look at them to understand the people that made and wore them. And yeah, my mind just was completely blown open by all the different interpretations and possibilities, as potentially they could be shamans' outfits, or they could be hunting disguises. So that they're incredibly fascinating. So yeah, the site is essentially a settlement site, but it has lots of quirky material culture that was found there. And also there were some wetland platforms that were built around the lake. So the site was located near to a lake, a paleo lake that unfortunately isn't there anymore. But yeah, so these hunter-gatherers are incredibly skilled, and they lived there for at least 800 years, which, or you know, intermittently perhaps over 800 years, which is just incredible when you think about, we perceive hunter-gatherers as very nomadic and moving around a lot, and you know, maybe following migration patterns and things like that. But actually, Star Carr is such a clear case that people were persisting in the landscape, and there was clearly something meaningful about that site, because people were staying there and staying there for such a long time, over generations.
So where does so obviously with the site, you've got the flint scatters and faunal remains and so on. So your focus is on reinterpreting or initially interpreting the flint that's been found there?
So the flint has actually been very thoroughly analysed by some amazing researchers. So Chantal Canella and Amy Little, they had a real close look at the flint scatters at Star Carr. There was over 24,000 flints found. So a lot of material to get through, as I'm sure you can imagine. So they've looked at the lithics in terms of sort of essentially grouping them into different categories to what we would call typologies. So you're identifying the lithics and you're looking at the different shapes and the morphology of the tool, and essentially using that to dictate how to categorize the flint, just to make it a bit easier to look at and to sort of analyze the tools. And then Amy Little, she has done some amazing work on the microwear. So looking at how these tools were actually used by the hunter-gatherers. And that also was complemented by refitting analysis that Chantal did. So not only did she do all the identifications of typology, she also did the refitting analysis, which is kind of quite groundbreaking, really, because you can see essentially how a tool was made by tracking the different flakes that were removed by the individual as they were making whichever tool they were making. So it's quite incredible because you can see the movement of tools across the site and gives you an insight into the movement of people, which on such a small scale is actually quite rare. So it's really, really quite amazing, the results that they had.
So there's a couple of techniques there. So we've got sort of microwear and refitting. So your expertise is in microwear. So just give us a sort of a basic definition or understanding of what microwear is. What does it involve?
So microwear is essentially looking at how a tool was used. So you look at different levels of information on the tool. So you start off by looking at the tool with the naked eye, and you're looking at essentially the tool edge, because usually that's where we would assume that the tool was used, or where the traces of use would be located on the tool. You're then able to look at it at what we would call a low power approach. So looking at it in quite general terms, but under a low magnification microscope. So again, then you're looking at the flint edge specifically, and you're looking at areas of damage perhaps. So when individuals use a tool, depending on the hardness of the material, you'll get different removals essentially on the tool's edge. So depending on the hardness, so a hard material like wood would have quite a lot of removals on the edge because it's quite abrasive, and it will essentially take off flint from the flint's edge. So you would see that and you'd think that that tool had been used on quite a hard material. However, other materials, so soft materials like meat or plants, are quite hard to see because they don't actually make any clear sign of use on the flint's edge. So that's when we tend to look at high power approaches, and with all flints we look at them under a high magnification to make sure that we're seeing exactly how the tool was used. So this is high magnification between usually about sort of 40 to 100 times magnification on a microscope. And we look at that, or look at the flint under the high power to see polish. And polish is the very, very diagnostic use trace that we identify with microwear, because different materials have different traces that they leave on the flint's edge. So you can begin to sort of interpret and differentiate between wood, plant, hide, meat, bone, and that kind of thing. So it's incredible because you get access to things that actually archaeologically, certainly from prehistory, wouldn't preserve, such as plants, and we can see that they're used, whereas without microwear and before it was actually developed as a methodology, people unhelpfully, but also unknowingly, just assumed that plants were just not used by hunter-gatherers, and the sort of man the hunter the sort of idea definitely dominated discussions, which means that we have quite a warped sense perhaps of actually how hunter-gatherers lived and what they ate and that kind of thing.
So I've always seen it as quite a subtle art, microwear, whenever I've seen people do it, because it seems to be a lot of interpreting very nuanced sort of marks of polish and so on left on the edges of the blade. But it's quite an interesting one, because the marks are left as diagnostic of what the blade was used, or what the tool was used on. So this is where the experimental archaeology perhaps comes in, because if you don't know what those things look like beforehand, then you can't necessarily link a one-to-one material with that polish. So just maybe explore a little bit how experimental archaeology works in relation to microwear.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that without experimental sort of reference collection pieces, you are quite blind really when it comes to looking at the archaeological tools, because like I said, although you can see maybe the attrition on the flint edge being related to a hard material, in terms of kind of going a bit further in trying to interpret more specifically what the material was, it's very hard to do that without an experimental collection that you can compare with, kind of like you can use it almost like a spot the difference, you know, have the archaeological flint and the experimental flint. And by looking at both, you can begin to see, am I seeing the archaeological flint as used on this material or not? So it's really helpful. And I think experimentally, the experimentally produced flint is really insightful, because you can also look at things like hafting traces as well. So use wear as a definition, or as a broader category, it does include things like hafting traces, as well as use traces. So with experimental archaeology, we've been able to actually try and pin down a bit more about how we're able to identify these on the archaeological tools, because obviously you've got a lot more to contend with archaeological specimens, because they have a lot more post-depositional sort of modifications to them, being in the ground for 11,000 years. They're obviously not going to be as clean and crisp as the ones that you produce experimentally. So by having that experimental collection, you can sort of see polish at its best, and at its most sort of, I guess, at its clearest. And then you can start using that as a sort of a basis to then look at the archaeological material to see if you're seeing sort of similar patterns, similar distribution of the polish, and you can gain essentially a more specific idea of what the archaeological flint was used on. Although it's worth noting, with all microwear, everything that we do is interpretive. So we always have to sort of caveat any results that we have with the understanding that it's a subjective interpretation, as a lot of science actually is. And what we're seeing is very much a subjective opinion that we do cross-reference, but it's not going to be, you know, 100% accurate all the time. And so that's something that you have to accept, I think. But I think that's something that you have to accept in all areas of science, as it's never ever objective, or as objective as we want it to be. So
yeah, with experimental work, you're almost trying to replicate the very complex working approaches that people use. You know, even if you think of using something like a kitchen knife, the different ways you hold it and the pressure that you put on it and the materials that you use against it and underneath it, all, I mean, you would know better than I, but they probably all add to the polish and the damage that you'd see on the edges of a tool. So in some sense, you're trying to tease apart all of these different variables, which must be incredibly frustrating.
yeah, it's, I think, even sort of even to the finer details of actually the surface of the flint. So depending on the raw material and where the flint was actually sourced from, you'll have, the polish will develop essentially very differently, and it's very variable. So that's why I think with experimental archaeology, I think with all experimental archaeology this is the case, but you really have to have a scientific approach to things, and you have to have as much a sort of a like for like as possible. So you have, if you're looking at, so for Star Carr, for example, we're looking at raw materials from coastal and till flint. So when we're looking at the experimental collection, you try and match that as much as possible, because that can vary, the development of the polish can vary significantly, just from the changes of the raw material. So that, I think, yeah, you are absolutely right that there are definitely the nuances and so many differences that can change the development of polish, even as much as the hardness of the surface that you're working on.
I suppose this is the essence of the scientific method, isn't it? Is and where experimental archaeology comes into its own, is that you can try and make a list of all those different variables that you know from previous experiments, and then you can try and hold as many as you can static and just play around with one. So say time, how long you use a tool for, and you would know better than I, but I imagine that 5 minutes versus an hour on a flint tool probably makes a huge difference to the polish at the end of it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, with experimental archaeology in general, I think there are so many variables that you rarely are able to get. It's not a clean lab kind of situation and I think that's actually so much to do with the huge advantage of it, and also the enjoyment of it, is that it's not just this pristine sort of environment. There are variables that you can't control, but generally there are definitely there are things that you can hold as a constant to help you make your interpretations of the archaeological material. But I think in microwear, there's definitely a bit of a discourse between the idea of actualistic experimentation and controlled experimentation for interpreting the microwear traces on archaeological tools. An actualistic experiment would be, let's make a basket from reeds and let's do all the different stages of basket making, so harvesting the reed, processing, and then weaving. And then let's see the flint tools and let's note down exactly how long they're used for and how they are used, so cutting or scraping. And then we use that and those tools to then look at the archaeological material, because it's more representative of actual usage of flint, i.e. in an actual activity and making something as a whole. Whereas a more controlled experiment would be, let's use a flint on reed for scraping for 5 minutes and let's see what the polish looks like. And for me, and at York, we tend to go with the more actualistic experimentation, because it's just that it is more representative of actual activity and hunter-gatherer behavior, or the perceived hunter-gatherer behavior, that really, would they just sit there scraping reed for 5 minutes? Probably not. Would they be scraping reed to produce twine for a particular purpose? Probably. So it's much more interesting and actually representative of the archaeological material to follow that line of experimentation, doing whole activities, and rather than just doing sort of random activities or random sort of sequences of actions that may actually not constitute or relate to anything specific.
Well, talking of actualistic experiments, how have you found doing some flintknapping on your own?
Well, I find flintknapping it's incredibly good fun. I think you learn a lot about yourself, patience, resilience, I think, having no shame and losing a bit of dignity, I think, when you realize it's not as easy as some people make it look. I think it's really important. It was really important for me when I started my PhD that I give it a go and I try. I mean, I was never going to become a flint specialist by the time I finished my PhD, but I wanted to try and just be able to produce some kind of haphazard functional tool for me to be able to appreciate the work and the mindset and the processes essentially that go into producing a tool. I mean, at Star Carr, the tools that we found there, or that were found there, were certainly by no means stunning. They were quite functional, I think would be a kind way of saying it, more functional than aesthetic. So you're not seeing any of those beautiful Paleolithic hand axes or anything. They're very much, very functional and quite sort of underwhelming if you're being harsh, I think.
But some of them look almost on the fly, don't they? They've got a sort of rough quality to them.
But
they're not aiming for symmetry or something like that. They're just going for function.
Yeah, but I think for me it sort of struck a chord, actually, because I think if I was in the Mesolithic, and obviously, you know, we only can dream about this. I've always wanted to time travel, but I'm well aware it's impossible. But I think that I would definitely be more interested in creating tools for function and for use, essentially, so I could make something that was aesthetically pleasing, like a basket or, you know, like a pendant. I think the idea of spending hours over a tool is incredible, but I genuinely just I don't have the patience, I don't think. And so for me, this idea of sporadic making and use of tools is probably more in line with where I would put myself than this sort of beautiful, painstaking Paleolithic hand axes that you see. They're stunning, but the sort of, you have to dedicate your life, I think, to being able to have the skill to produce something like that. And I'm not sure that would have been me in the prehistory. I think I'm much more of a make a basket for something that's really functional, rather than just that I can put up on my hut wall and look at every so often.
Well, speaking of huts, why don't you talk us through your involvement with the legendary Star Carr hut that we have at the year centre?
Legendary it is indeed, yes. So I was really fortunate that during my time in my PhD, that we were able to build the Mesolithic hut in the year centre, and I was really lucky to be a very small part of that. But just being spectating the build of it over the weekend was amazing. So I gave up my weekend gladly, so I could be there and watch from essentially very, very minimal, or watch from the beginning. So before it became even posts or even post holes, I was able to see it constructed. And I think Leo and Deirdre, who were involved in constructing it, planning it, and crafting it, were wonderful. They were really, really very open to me watching them, but also actually helping out at different parts, which was really good fun. So I was able to, tie some twine on to secure the thatching and that kind of thing, which was really good fun, and climb on the framework of the hut, which was great. But for me, the biggest thing about seeing that in terms of how it relates to my research was seeing how it was the day-to-day small decisions that Leo and Deirdre were making when they were constructing the hut. For me, it really opened my mind to the different, or the ways that we're looking at the hunter-gatherers at Star Carr, because we maybe take for granted that these materials and the tools and everything would have had to have been made specifically for that task. And I think the knowledge of when to process, or when to sort of cut down the trees, when to harvest the plants and the willow, the hazel, when is a good time to harvest it, when the sap is in enough there that they can make and wind the wood round to make the doors and the frames. And it was just the knowledge of the environment, I guess, to put it, or to summarize it succinctly, was just incredible. And it was just an innate understanding of their materials, and that for me was just really eye-opening, but really insightful as well, because to look at the structures at Star Carr, it's so easy just to see features and post holes and go, okay, so that was one there, it probably looked like a dome shape, or perhaps more of a triangular shape. It was covered in hides or turf perhaps, and just to see it as a very functional space, rather than an investment of time and of planning, of forethought. There was so much that went into that I think, for me, watching that hut structure being built by just plant materials alone, using predominantly Mesolithic tools, that for me was a real eye-opener. And I think I wish everyone could see how skilled they were, but also to see that process, to really get an appreciation for the people that built structures in the past that didn't have access to metal tools as we do now. So it was amazing, an amazing experience.
Well, that's a brilliant place to finish on, I think, and a good sort of advert for people to come and do experimental archaeology.
Absolutely.
Well, so thanks very much, and we will probably have you on again in the future, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Interviewing somebody else, and go and enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you so much.
No, cheers. Thanks, Jess.
Bye.
Thanks very much for listening. Don't forget to check the description for details on the places we mention, and the terminology if you want to follow up on our conversation. See you next time.